On this week's edition of the Palace of Pistons podcast, Chaz Lanier is your newest Detroit Piston. We talk about the fit. We talk about Lanier's fit with the team. And we also talk about Dennis Schroder and another NBA team vying for his services in free agency, according to a very well-sourced NBA reporter. All that and a little bit more on this week's edition of the Palace of Pistons podcast, brought to you by Believe. Let's do it.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another exciting night of NBA basketball.
The Pistons are digging in. They got the depth. They got the big men. They got the better basketball team. No doubt about it.
Pistons need a three, and they have just under 3 seconds to do it. Here's Chauncey Billups. Here it is. He's got it. He's got it. Chauncey Billups hits the three. Overtime. Amazing. Out of bounds. Detroit basketball.
Pistons fans, welcome back to another edition of the Palace of Pistons podcast, brought to you by Believe. It's myself, Aaron Johnson, and joining me is Jasper Apollonia. We are conglomerating just moments after the Detroit Pistons made their single draft pick on night 2 of the 2025 NBA draft, picking at 37. Obviously, if you're listening to this, you know that they took Tennessee sharpshooting guard Chaz Lanier. Jasper, my friend, how are we doing? And I guess let's just start there. How are we feeling about Detroit's pick at 37?
Yeah, Aaron, I mean, we're recording this, we should be clear, before the second round is actually over. So we're going to look really, really stupid if the Pistons end up trading back in. I don't see it happening. And it's for the same reasons that I feel the way I do about the selection of Chaz Lanier. He is what we said last week, and let's give ourselves a little bit of credit here. He was the guy that we both ended up settling on as our ideal target if the Pistons stayed at 37, which they did. He is a sharpshooter out of Tennessee, a guy who was without a doubt a late riser, a late bloomer, somebody who was not like a go-to prospect from day one. He was like 5'6" his freshman year of high school, worked his way up from the freshman team to JV to varsity to North Florida, and then eventually transferring to Tennessee, where he shot 39% from three last year. So this is a guy who definitely fits the Pistons' mentality, the work ethos, that type of guy who is going to go to work every single day, who's going to bust his ass, who's going to get the most out of his talent level. In terms of on the court, like we said, he is a sharpshooter. He's a three-point specialist for sure. He does have a little bounce in him, but nothing that you're going to be depending on the next level. You're drafting him for shooting. Yeah. And as we discussed last week, I think his role on this team is going to be something like a Marcus Sasser replacement. I haven't seen enough from Sasser to be like, I'm interested in giving him anything close to a multi-year deal. He hasn't shown the ability to create as a primary guard, either in backup minutes or even like sharing the floor. He just hasn't even given you really secondary creation in his 2 years in the NBA. He's been an okay but streaky three-point shooter, and he hasn't finished at the rim. And really the issue has been, too, he's undersized defensively. So while he's tenacious on that end of the floor, he has certain physical limitations that he'll never be able to overcome, probably. On the other hand here with Lanier, you're talking about a guy who's 6'5". There is just a little bit more upside in regards to the role that you expect him to play on a Pistons team that is looking to take the next step in the East this year. Aaron, I'm guessing you probably look at pretty similarly. Is there a different way you're approaching this selection, though?
No, and first let's go over the numbers for Lanier. Last season at Tennessee, he after playing 4 seasons at North Florida, 18 points, 4 rebounds, shot 39.5% from the 3-point line, was their go-to scorer. And we talk about the three-point shooting numbers with him. He is more than just a catch-and-shoot three-point shooter. He can catch off the movement. He can, come off movement, come off screens, on movement, hit those types of shots. He can put the ball on the floor. He's pretty good at putting the ball on the floor, getting to the mid-range, getting to his spot. He's a versatile scorer. You mentioned some of the bounce he has, so that gives him some finishing ability at the rim. He can score the ball in many ways. He is not just the prototypical catch and shoot three-point shooting guy. Like, there is more to his scoring repertoire than that, and that is his bread and butter NBA skill, is his ability to score the basketball. And, last week when we talked about this pick for Detroit, my big thing was, especially considering some of the guys that they have hitting unrestricted free agency, they may want to draft a guy that ends up being a little bit older because he has one or two NBA-ready skills, so that if need be, and this player gets vaulted into a rotation spot for one reason or the other, the Pistons know he has some sort of skill that can contribute on day one. For Lanier, that's the shooting, that's the scoring, and I completely like this pick. This was one of the guys that I wrote about on palaceofpistons.com, about 5 options for Detroit at 37. One of the guys I also wrote about was Hanson Yang, but I guess Portland had other ideas, taking him at 16 in the first round. But no, I like this pick for Detroit. Jasper, there are some people that don't like this pick, of course, because there are always going to be people, there's going to be people on one side of the other. And that's not to say that the people that don't like the pick are necessarily wrong. Everybody's entitled to their own opinions. But when you look at the board, you look at who was still available at 37 when Detroit was picking, did anyone else really stand out to you, or was this kind of the foregone conclusion that Lanier was the right guy?
Well, the other guy that I mentioned on last week's podcast in Cam Jones went immediately after Chaz Lanier did to the San Antonio Spurs. So that was the other guy I would have made an argument for right there. Yeah, I mean, for me, I think that was the only other player, and he went immediately after. I think there's maybe an argument to be made about, could they have traded up, blah, blah, blah. For me, the way I look at it, I know people are going to have their opinions on this pick. To be honest with you, there were not really many other guys in the second round that I was looking at that I really felt had such a high upside that it was worth taking them over somebody with a proven NBA skill set in terms of shooting. And I think you brought up a great point in terms of the movement shooting, the screen stuff. That's a big part of Detroit's game offensively. They love to run pin down screens for their shooters. They love to get guys coming off of screens. Malik Beasley just hit 300 threes last year. And how many of those were him running to the perimeter, coming around a screen, catching, rising, and hitting the shot? Lanier has definitely a funkier shot, a little slower release. I think if you have a reason to be concerned, that's one. Another reason to be concerned also is that he is definitely like an older guy. He's older than Jaden Ivey. He's like 6 months younger.
Is that a concern for you? Is
no
a big deal for you?
No, I just think when you're looking at
what I've seen in the pushback to taking him, and without talking about the fact that all of the guys, the large majority of the guys being taken in this area of the draft are 22, 23. They're seniors in college. I don't understand that being such a big deal.
I understand it in the lottery, like a Dalton Connect, for example, a player who I was not, you and like Tim were way higher on him than I was. But I think if you're drafting in the second round, if you're drafting for fit, not for, hey, we need this to be, our number 3 scorer in 2 years. If you're just drafting a guy to be a back end of the bench rotation player piece, I have no issue with that. And in fact, I don't mind it at all. I think if anything, it's a bit of an upside thing for you there, because in Lanier's case, like, he's somebody that's used to being overlooked, somebody that's used to having to work his way up. I don't think it's going to be a big issue for him in a way that it might be for a young player who hasn't really proven himself and kind of has that need to do so. I think somebody like Lanier, it's probably going to be easier for him to fit in when you just look at his history, like as a player, as a prospect, and as somebody who like has had to make those moves and has had to sacrifice in the past. Like when he was at North Florida, he was coming off the bench until his senior year. And then he put up a 50, 40, 90 season.
Yeah.
That's the exact kind of mentality you want for a player you're taking at 37 when the expectation is he's not going to be somebody that's contributing. Like people are getting upset, but it's like, this is not like the Troy Weaver era second round picks where you're like, hey, we actually need to find some value here. Like you can't just throw this away on a dude who is a draft and stash or might only play for the Crews. You need to find something in the second round. That's not necessarily the case here.
Look, you mentioned Troy Weaver, and I feel like I just have to interject there.
Yeah.
Give him a shout out for making just an absolutely abysmal draft night trade alongside Joe Dumars in New Orleans. If you don't know, those are the two top execs in New Orleans for those listening. And the trade that they made with Atlanta to move up from 23 to 13 to take Derek Queen, whose big connection was Troy Weaver and Troy Weaver's son. And by the way, they gave up an unprotected 2026 New Orleans Pelicans first-round pick in what is going to be a very good draft, and from a team that, unless I just am not able to see, they're going to be a bottom 5 team in their conference next year. It was just an absolutely hilarious move. Now that we're watching him from the outside and you can see the perspective there, it's just that classic example of Troy Weaver going and getting his guy, no matter what the cost is, no matter what it does to hamper the flexibility and the potential of the team down the line. Just a hilarious decision that no doubt Troy Weaver's hands were on, but also Joe Dumars signed off on. The Pelicans have had a brutal start to the offseason, but
the death by 1,000 cuts GM strikes again. This guy is just like, it's so I really feel bad for Pelicans fans. I really truly do, because I remember being in this exact same position where like, well, that's maybe more than I would have given up. I don't think he got good value here, but okay, he likes his guy, go get his guy. You know, if the player works out, it's worth it. Oh, Aaron.
Yeah.
Oh, Aaron, how young and naive we were. But now we're jaded, bitter old men, and we see through his tricks.
No, this is Troy Weaver learning. You know, he said, okay, I learned from my time in Detroit. I don't want to put a first-round pick out there that has protections for the next 5 seasons. Let me just give him an unprotected one right off the bat so I don't have to worry about those protections down the line. That way I can trade my 2028 first as soon as possible. So
he did it. And he did it before he's traded Trey Murphy or Zion Williamson. So it's like,
I did it last night. If I'm the Pistons, I'm dialing up Joe Dumars and Troy Weaver's line and saying, hey, I've got 4 or 5 second-round picks that are available for Trey Murphy, because they might just be the guys to take that type of deal.
If Troy Weaver knows somebody that's like going to be a second-round pick in next year's draft, I think you can absolutely do it. You might be able to get a first-round pick back.
Yeah, start looking at his LinkedIn connections and see what you can pull together there. There's a good opportunity for somebody. But yeah, back to what we were talking about before that man was named. I'm not concerned with the age at all. I'm in agreement with you on it actually being a good thing, because if you're the Pistons and your expectation is not just to be status quo, you want to improve, you want to get better, you want to see a jump in record, you want to jump up the standings in the conference, odds are the guy you're taking in the second round is not going to be a regular rotation contributor for you then. So taking a 19-year-old that's very raw, that hasn't played a ton, that doesn't have a lot of NBA-ready skills, just for him to sit on your bench doesn't really do anything. You know, it's kind of what happened with Bobby Klintman last year, just because the Pistons were so much better than the expectations were for them. And so he never got to see the court in Detroit, and he really only got to play in the G League when he was finally healthy. They would have been in that similar situation as long as this team doesn't disintegrate in the offseason. So you take a guy that, in worst case scenario, and break glass, you know, let's say that the Pistons aren't able to bring back Malik Beasley and Tim Hardaway Jr., at least they know they have someone on the roster that can shoot the ball in Chaz Lanier. Like, that's worst case scenario. But then you start thinking about, well, let's say they bring back Beasley or whatever, they have an injury and they're missing someone in the rotation. Lanier is a guy that is a plug-and-play option because of the skill set that he has. So I think the concerns about his age are just being a little bit outdone. It's what most of the guys at this section of the draft are. So I'm just not going to sit here and be all too concerned about that.
Yeah, I mean, like, why would you draft like a raw toolsy player? I saw people being like, "Oh, he's going to ball out for the Crews next year." I'm like, that's a bad thing. Like, why you don't want the number 37 overall pick getting regular minutes for your team if you are taking the path, if you have the trajectory that the Pistons are supposed to have for next year.
Right.
Like, Bobby Klintman barely played for the Pistons. Good. We liked his skill set. We liked what we saw in Summer League. That's great. I didn't want to see it on the court last year because that meant the Pistons were in a bad position. So, yeah, I mean, I think, again, this is like a break-in case of emergency type of player with a very specific skill set, one that you are probably going to need at some point in the year. And you still have Marcus Sasser for the season. So, like, worst case scenario, you just see which one of them is better if they're forced into action. I see no downside, really.
Yeah, and I look at some of the guys that have been picked so far after, and I just don't know, what else Detroit really could have done. I think maybe if you liked Maxime Renaud from Stanford, if you liked him, athletic center, can shoot the ball a little bit. If you're telling me that was the right pick, I'm also saying, like, they have Jalen Duren, they have Isaiah Stewart, so
and Paul Reed,
guy that can play. Well, Paul Reed's a free agent, but they could bring him back.
Yeah, you're right. Sorry,
but it's like, is there really some major opportunity for him to play? Like, if you're worried about Lanier not playing, I think you're looking at the same situation, and that's again the byproduct of being a playoff team. You're not drafting in the second round for a night one contributor at the start of the next season. So
yeah.
And the guys that went before him are, other guys that I'd be interested in. If the Pistons didn't take Chaz Lanier because Janai Broom fell to him or Ryan Kalkbrenner fell to him, like, that would have been fine. If Rasheer Fleming would have fell to him, that would have been great. Like, that the guys that fell off the board ahead of him are guys that you would have been okay with Detroit taking. But, the one other guy that I really was interested in was Tyrese Proctor, who, as of pick 45, has not been selected yet, which is a little bit surprising to me. I also thought maybe there was a Duke connection there between him and general manager Trajan Langdon. So that was really the only other guy. I mean, I would have been okay with Renaud from Stanford. I talked about Kobe Brea as well. But that's, another kind of older shooter. I think Chaz Lanier is in the kind of the same lineage as that, and he might be a little bit better because of the stuff he can do with putting the ball on the floor. So I think I don't want to overreact to a second round pick. We tend to fall in that because, well, this year the Pistons didn't have a lottery pick. They didn't pick 5th. They didn't pick 14th. Like, this is all that we had to really watch and wait for. And so everyone's all excited. Everyone's all emotional. Everyone's all geared up. They got the guy that was fine. He's got an NBA-ready skill set. He's got a really good skill in shooting. You can never have too much shooting in the NBA. So very, very fine with the Chaz Lanier pick. Jasper, as you watched the draft play out, I know this is something that we talked about last week and trading into the first round. Both of us were against it, but as you watched the draft play out, did your mind change? Did you feel like Detroit should have tried to get in at some point in the first?
In the first round, no, not necessarily, because the guy I might have traded up for went with the first pick of the second round. I thought Fleming would have been a really interesting pick. We've talked about Detroit probably needing to go after a dynamic, athletic, stretch 4 kind of guy. He definitely fits the mold there. It would have been an interesting pick. It would have been definitely a higher upside pick in my opinion. But as we've already said on this podcast, that's not necessarily the position the Pistons are in. He makes a lot more sense, in my opinion, going to a team like the Phoenix Suns, who are in that weird spot where it's like, well, we need to kind of rebuild, but we also kind of can't rebuild because we don't own any of our first round picks. So we need to get like guys that might pop off, that might be able to be something next to Devin Booker, like a Mark Williams. So this is a kind of pick that makes sense for a team like that, in my opinion. I think it's a better situation for him. I don't know if it necessarily would have been the right fit in Detroit, but like if you're somebody that is of the opinion that in the second round you should always go after the highest upside guy, I totally understand that. I think that's a totally logical, reasonable opinion to take. That's how you get a Nikola Jokic on your team. It happens. On the other hand, if you really could predict who the highest upside guys are in the second round, then Nikola Jokic would not have gone during a Taco Bell commercial. He would have they would have sprinted up to the podium to take him number one. So like I think that's kind of the mentality I take with this. I think either approach would have been totally reasonable if they had traded up, traded an extra second round pick to move up a little bit more, get somebody they liked, sure. But also when we're talking about guys that went in the back end of the first round, even the middle, 20s, I mean, what we talked about Danny Wolf last week, he ended up going 27.
I can't believe there was talk about him going 10. Oh my goodness.
Well, I mean, look who went 16. I mean, look what the Nets did. Look what the Trailblazers did. Like, I don't think the Nets had an especially good draft by any means. They had 5 first-round picks. How many rotation players do they get out of those for like 5 first-rounders? I would be surprised if it's more than 2, to be honest with you. And I might even be a little nice by saying 2. So
well, they took 3 point guards. It felt like they took 3 point guards. They're like, all right, if we go 1 for 3 here, we're good. Like that's what it felt like.
But you have to think about it, Aaron. Remember, years ago, the Phoenix Suns had a 3-headed point guard trio. They had Eric Bledsoe and Isaiah Thomas and Goran Dragic. And, they missed the playoffs. But at least they were able to trade those. Well, actually, no, they didn't get anything back of value because everybody knew they had to move their guards. What was I saying again? I'm sorry. I smell toast.
Yeah.
No, ridiculous. But also it's like, where's the playing time for Killian Hayes now,
No, he's not still on the roster, is he? No way.
No, he's still gone. No, but bring him back.
Speaking of point guards, though, I actually do want to talk about this. We'll move on from draft talk here. There's only so much you can say about second-round picks for a playoff team at this point. But I do want to talk about an important topic because there was a report from Mark Stein that point guard free agent Dennis Schroder is highly coveted by the Sacramento Kings, and there's a good chance that Schroder ends up in Sacramento, which means Detroit would have a hole at the backup point guard position. I mean, first off, what's that loss of Schroder mean in a free agency class where there's not a ton of point guard options available? You're talking about alongside Schroder, it's D'Angelo Russell, who's apparently linked to the Dallas Mavericks. There's Russell Westbrook, and then there's Ty Jerome. What does Detroit do if they lose Dennis Schroder?
I think from my perspective, you'll figure something out. I'm just really not all that worried about it. And I said that last week on the podcast. I know you have been more vocal about your desire to bring back Schroder, but the reality is you got him for nothing, and you will be able to get another backup guard during the season for next to nothing. It will happen, especially, and I feel like we're going to just be hammering. We're going to be talking about this like at least once or twice a month for up until after the trade deadline. With the new CBA, teams are going to be way more willing to offload salary. Like they're just going to be more willing to do it. If you can eat it, they will give you a player. And that's another reason. I mean, we saw some like little murmurs about John Collins maybe being a guy. Like it's going to be like that for the next year while teams realize they have to dump salary. So for me, I'm not concerned about it. If Schroeder's getting more than like not even an MLE, like I don't know, like 10 million a year, it's just not worth it for me. Yeah, and it never was. So I just think that I liked him. I'm glad he was on the team. He was certainly helpful, but there are other players like Dennis Schroder out there, and you will be able to get them.
Yeah, if Sacramento wants to give Dennis Schroder $12 million over if they want to sign him to a 2-year, $24 million deal, you tip your cap and you let him walk. I have been vocal about bringing Dennis Schroder back, or if they let him walk, they have to fill that gap. I understand that come the deadline, there will be a team that they can get a guard from like they did last year. But if they're serious about taking that next step, I would make sure that I have a backup point guard on the roster before the season starts. Because if they had Dennis Schroder all of last season, they're closer to a 50-win team than they are 44, most likely. I feel like that's fair to say, thinking about some of those minutes that Marcus Sasser was giving them earlier in the season when he was playing. So, looking at the other free agents, I already mentioned Westbrook. I already mentioned D'Angelo Russell. Trey Jones is another, or Tyus Jones is another option. I think Trey Jones is a free agent too, but Tyus Jones is the better of the brothers. He was also a target for Detroit last year, but ended up going to Phoenix. And then, the pipe dream is Chris Paul decides to come play and tutor Cade Cunningham for a season or two. But I don't know if he's signing in Detroit for a cheaper contract than Dennis Schroder would. So those are really the only other free agent options. I think that, if they don't make something happen there, they've got to scour that trade market, see if there's one of those teams teetering alongside the second apron that they're trying to shed some salary and keep trying to fix that hole if it's created.
I think for me, the biggest fear when it comes to losing Schroeder is not even necessarily about Dennis Schroeder. It's about Jaden Ivey. And, speaking of, the comments being made, Trajan Langdon did say that he expects both Jaden Ivey and Isaiah Stewart to be ready for the start of the season. In regards to Stewart, I think that's a little bit surprising. It seems as if his injury in the playoffs was a little bit more severe than we originally were led to believe. But in regards to Jaden Ivey, I think the real fear here is, look, he broke his leg. That's not a insignificant injury. I can tell you that. Like, I think anybody who's ever broken their leg, especially in their 20s, when you're past being a little kid, it 100% is going to have an effect on his athleticism. How much of an effect? We don't know. But so much has been made of Ivy being such an explosive player, but also his limitations with finishing at the rim. I think that there is more risk in what the recovery process looks like for him than maybe fans are entirely prepared to deal with. Like, if he does lose 10% off his fastball, it changes things. And you can say, well, he's still really explosive. Yeah. But look what happened to Stanley Johnson. Stanley Johnson went from being a great athlete to having a couple injuries that didn't seem so bad, but he went from being a superb athlete to being just an okay one and being completely unplayable. So I think that there's real risk there if you go into next season and Jaden Ivey is not the player that he was this last year, which already was an imperfect fit. Then what do you do? If you're left without another guard, I think then you start really getting worried. That's where you go to yourself, well, maybe we should have traded in the first round for Jace Richardson or something. I don't know. I think that just for me is that's the biggest fear is not even Dennis Schroder. It's Jaden Ivey.
Yeah, I was a bit surprised by the news that came out, or the comment from Trajan Langdon, because Isaiah Stewart was being listed as questionable for every game during the playoff series. My thought there is that, maybe he had at the end of the season after they were eliminated that ended up opting for some sort of procedure that got something done. So that started his recovery timeline, but there was no report on that or anything of that nature. And then, the Ivy stuff was interesting because I feel like we were sitting there, towards the end of last season thinking that, based off the timeline, Ivy should, even if he didn't return at the end of the season, he was close to at least getting on the court to get back into, his game mode and do all the on-court stuff. He was doing stuff on the court during their playoff series. He just wasn't doing 5-on-5 stuff. So for that to be for us to still be hearing that 2 months later that they're not fully back yet, I thought that comment was a little bit interesting. Maybe that's Langdon playing a little coy, and maybe they're good. I guess we don't really know, but I did think that was interesting. So yeah, the guard spot for Detroit's important. I mean, you have to have guards in the NBA, and Cade Cunningham does not play 82 games every year, so you have to have guys that can take some of that burden, that can spot start when needed, and fill some of that gap. So the guard spot will be a big part of Detroit's offseason. I feel like if they are worried about Jaden Ivey long term, and Dennis Schroder is going to walk away when free agency begins.
I think one potential solution there could be another player that Trajan Langdon was asked about during his press conference, Asar Thompson. Something that Trajan Langdon mentioned was that Asar was working on three things in particular: his shooting, obviously, his strength and conditioning, which was great to hear as well, because as we brought up on the podcast multiple times, he did not get an offseason last year. He didn't have the same luxury as his twin brother to get a real offseason in order to develop his skills, to develop his strength, to train. He was at a disadvantage there. But the thing I really liked hearing was that he's also working on his ball handling skills, especially in the pick and roll. And I think that if he does make some of those improvements like his brother did, well, then you're not feeling the loss of Dennis Schroder whatsoever, because, I mean, shoot, if he's putting up, Amen type of production as a ball handler on top of what he already brings defensively, you're doing just fine. You're good without another guard. You don't want to take the ball out of him, Cade. You don't want to take the ball out of those guys' hands at all, ever.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's everything that I think we need to cover today. We will certainly have more stuff in the coming weeks as we now get to that part of the offseason where everything ramps up. And it's funny because we went straight from the NBA draft to just a few days later, straight from the end of the NBA finals into the NBA draft. And now it's all going to kick into gear to another level, because you go into Summer League, and when Summer League starts, free agency starts on June 30th. We're 4 days away from free agency starting on June 30th at 6 p.m. Summer League starts that first week of July. It is going to pick up incredibly fast here. There's going to be so much more to talk about, so much more to cover. But that's what we've got today. Some stuff on the second-round draft pick, Chaz Lanier, the newest Detroit Piston, and also some stuff on Dennis Schroder potentially walking to Sacramento in free agency. That is going to do it for this week's edition of the Palace of Pistons Podcast, brought to you by Believe. Thanks so much for watching and listening. We'll see you guys next time.